In Brussels, a meeting of EU interior ministers trying to find a compromise on asylum and migration rules has drawn to a close with an agreement expected only in the next few days. Germany says it's agreed to stricter processing rules for asylum seekers and migrants coming into the EU. But Italy appears to be blocking a pact over standards in detention centres and the role of NGOs in supporting migrants. Several frontline countries say they can no longer deal with the large numbers of people arriving on their shores. And let's go straight to Brussels, where Rosie Burchett is following that meeting and standing by for us. Rosie, a lot of back and forth there on this crisis mechanism. Have leaders there offered any clarity?
We don't have any sort of real clarity yet, Gerhard, but it's no surprise because for years this topic of the European Union's migration and asylum policy has been incredibly politically toxic, incredibly divisive between EU member states. And in fact, the most controversial part of these reforms that the EU is trying to undertake has already got a green light. That was a few months ago when EU member states agreed on a plan for a more equitable distribution of migrants and asylum seekers arriving in countries like Italy, Greece and Spain to other parts of the European Union. So that big part of the deal is to some extent already done, but there was a missing piece of the legislative puzzle here, and it's this so-called crisis mechanism. It's a rule book on what countries as on the front line of this issue, so countries with coastal EU countries, Italy, Greece, Spain, as I mentioned, what they can do if large numbers of migrants and asylum seekers arrive on their shores all at once. Now, Germany had been one of the countries which was abstaining, which was causing a blockage here on this, but we just spoke to Germany's Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, who came out seeming very positive, saying that she had secured what she was looking for in terms of guarantees, for example, that families and children would be processed as a priority in these kind of more relaxed rule situations if there is indeed a crisis underway. But that being said, we saw just in the past few hours Italy's minister at this meeting literally walk out. So that means there is still no official agreement yet. But the ministers that are here, who have remained, and certainly the Spanish minister who was briefing press seemed quite upbeat, insisting that they think a compromise is within reach and that they're on the brink of a breakthrough.
So the Italian minister walked out. What exactly is Italy worried about then?
Well, listen, Italian sources are still being officially very tight-lipped here, but part of the backdrop and the history of all this is that Italy is one of those southern coastal EU countries which receives tens of thousands already of irregular migration arrivals to their shores this year. And because of the way EU migration asylum policy is set up, people who arrive must register for asylum, have their asylum request processed in that country where they first arrive. And that does put at least certainly an administrative burden on countries like Italy. And for years, Rome has been calling out to other countries saying that it needs more help. Now, we think part of the dispute here is also linked to Rome's reticence with regards to Germany supporting some non-profit organisations which help rescue migrants and asylum seekers making journeys toward Italy. Now, Italy's government has in the past said that it thinks those non-profit groups are essentially incentivising or encouraging people to make these very perilous journeys across the Mediterranean. So a division on that still exists. And I think it's fair to say that we will likely still be talking about this for years to come as one of this most, as I said, divisive topics between these EU member states based on, from one hand, the geography of these southern EU countries and countries further afield to the north, to the east, for example, that simply some of them say they don't want to take in what Italy, what Greece, what Spain would see as their fair share of the migrants arriving to their shores.
Rosie, very briefly, if the ministers come to an agreement, when will we see any effects?
Not anytime soon. That's because this agreement, if and when it comes, will then have to go to debate with the European Parliament, and then there will be an implementation period, so it's likely to be a couple of years before we see these rules taking effect. And of course, every day, more irregular migrants are arriving to the EU, and many of them, we should say hundreds already this year, have drowned or gone missing in their attempt to make it to Europe.
Rosie Burchett there in Brussels for us. Thank you very much, Rosie. And migration issues reach into other areas too, influencing political polls and helping the far right gain ground across Europe. It also poses problems for initiatives to help families get used to a new country and a new language. Programs to help children learn the language of their new host country, for example, are struggling as they become oversubscribed with a sudden intake of people.
2023, es ist Sommer.
Learning German isn't easy, but these kids are giving their best. This is a so-called welcome class. It is designed to get children who've recently arrived in Germany ready for regular school.
My favorite subject is sports.
I love to play with friends during the break.
These pupils from Ukraine or Afghanistan are getting a few hours a day focusing on German language skills. They all fled their home countries with their families. Some have been through traumatic experiences.
You always have to look, how does the child react? And the one child may have experienced something and they cannot talk about it and they are not even aware. And in that moment, you just have to be careful.
Around 11,000 children and teens are currently taking part in welcome classes in Berlin. But according to city data, more than 1,000 are still waiting for a place. The reason? A lack of rooms and teaching staff.
The problem has been known for months. The number of children who need a school place is increasing and there's still no solution.
Teaching union staffer Lydia Puschnerus says the city isn't doing enough to help schools provide these essential classes.
It's an injustice that is ultimately suffered by the child, and that cannot be the goal, not now and not in the years to come.
Berlin's Department for Education has said it needs more time to ramp up welcome classes. It did not respond to DW's requests for a statement. So for now, the problem remains, leaving many children without a crucial doorway to everyday life.
It's a nightmare. The children and all the families sit around all day with nothing to do. They're not allowed to pursue any activity and do not know what to do. Every day is without structure, long, boring and uniform.
Back in class, these children are the lucky ones, taking their first steps towards a full education in their new home.